Okay, we're going to start Shin Chaf Halacha Beis today. I'm going to talk about Mukaf. There's going to be two continuations related to Mukaf, but today is going to be the, so to speak, real topic of Mukaf. Okay, and Halacha Beis is like this. Before I say Halacha Beis, and Halacha Aleph we had said the din of Tzir of Sal. Okay, Shin Chaf Dal talked about Tzir in general. Shin Chaf Hey talked about Tzir of Sal. If you want to make things up to be a shear, then how you have to get them in a certain container, and all kinds of conditions of how you make a tzir to get up to a shear. So now the Shulchan Aruch says, "Im yesh b'kol isa kishir." Now, if you have two batches, but they don't have each less than a shear, they each have a shear. So the whole halacha aleph and all what came beforehand is not relevant anymore. We already took care of that part of it. We already have a shear. For right to the hafrash mizu al zu, and you want to be mafresh from one and the other. So ein tzarich letzir of kliv lo negia. You don't need tzir of kliv, which was halacha aleph. You don't need negia, which was halacha aleph and the simon beforehand. Even sheshtein lefanav. Since they're, as long as they're both in front of you, mafrishim mizu al zu, you could be mafresh from one or the other. You don't need any of those conditions that we had until now. So what he's saying is, there are many shittas in Rishonim who hold that in order to be mafresh from one batter on another, we need to have a qualification called Mukaf. We'll see in a second that's in Mishnayos. There's such a thing, you have to have Mukaf, and which means something to do with them being near each other. And many Rishonim hold that Mukaf means they have to actually be touching, or they have to be in a kli, or there are all kinds of different ideas of how close they have to be to each other. So when the Shulchan Aruch says they just have to be shteim lefanav, he's telling you that he's going like the most makel of those shittas of Rishonim, that they do not have to be touching, they don't have to be in a kli, they don't have to have all these other kind of connections to each other, just being in front of you, that's good enough. Okay, so if you read this din, if you just read this halacha beis, you would say is the Mukaf is paskening that in order to be Mukaf, all you have to do is have the two things in front of you. That's the only condition you need to have for Mukaf. Now, he definitely is trying to say that point. I'm not taking away from that, but you would understand that the entire din of Mukaf is no touching, no kli, kelim, no anything like that. As long as they're both in front of you, they're both in the same area, then that's good enough. Which is what he's trying to say. Like not like many Rishonim. If you look at this, that's what he said. Not like all these Rishonim. He's trying to be Mukaf.
What's his Russian?
Okay, and that's what he's trying to say. And now, he doesn't use the word mukaf over here. Okay? You'll hear the significance of that later. He doesn't use the word mukaf. In Shin Chaf Gimel, way at the beginning, he had talked about mukaf. In passing, he said, in Chalas Chutz Aretz, you don't need mukaf, but in Chalas Eretz Yisrael, you do need mukaf. It was one of the nafkamis in Eretz Yisrael and Chutz Aretz. But here he doesn't use the word mukaf, but seemingly what he's saying is, you can just do anything, as long as they're, seemingly what he's saying is that as long as you have the things in front of you in the same room, then that's considered mukaf. You can be mafresh from one better than the other. Okay. So that's what if you just read this, then that's what you would think. The Gra has a very, very long piece over here. The piece starts off with very strong words. It starts off with the words "bedin zen nistabku." I don't know if I pronounced that right. Go'inei olam. Okay. But you should just know that I'm about to clarify for you what's going on here, because go'inei olam, it's not clear who he means. Maybe even Rishonim didn't get this whole thing right. Go'inei olam messed up on this. I'm going to set you straight on what this is. The Gra. There's a very long beer over here, which starts off with those words that sort of like put you in your place. Nistavku. Nistav. Nistavku. Yeah, they got like confused. They like got messed up. Yeah, nevuchim. There we go. Same word. Okay, whichever one you want it to be. It's all of those things. Okay, so what? I'm going to first tell you in short what the Gra says, okay? And then we'll get into some of the details of what he says, which are actually very negative to us. Okay, he says like this. He says there are three categories of how, when you have more than one batter, when you have two batters and you want to be mafresh from one or the other, there are three different categories that there could be. And they are, if the items are loose, okay, in other words, I have on the table here, I have a bunch of challahs sitting on the table, there are a bunch of things that are loose, then the din is you can be mafresh from one or the other as long as they're in the same, I'll call it the same room. Okay, well, tzir of bias, as long as they're in the same room. Okay, the Gra says that's not mukaf. That's just mitzurif in the house. That's good enough. You can mafresh from one or the other one if they're loose. If they're in a kli, some kind of a container, then the din is if the containers are touching each other, then you can mafresh from one or the other. That's called mukaf. Okay, that's what mukaf is. The second category is mukaf. When they're in kelim, in some kind of a container or packaging, and they're touching each other, then you can mafresh from one or the other. That's what's mukaf. That's what the din of mukaf is. And the third category is if they're in a sealed container, a closed-up container, then no matter what, you can't be mafresh from one or the other. It doesn't make a difference. Even if they're touching each other, it makes no difference. If they're in a sealed container, you can't be mafresh from one to the other. Okay? So, that's the Gemara says these three categories. Now, as we'll go on,
What was the first two categories?
okay, the first category was the items are loose. They're not in any kind of a container. There's just a bunch of challahs sitting on the table. Now, as long as you're in the same room, you can be mafresh from one or the other.
That's called mukaf?
That is not called mukaf. No, that's just called the tzir of bias. Okay? You're going to hear where he gets that from. Okay? It's just mature. The bias pulls them together. No, not for challah. We're talking about for what we call mukaf. What we call mukaf, which is what you have a shear, you want to be mafresh from one or the other, you need something. What we call mukaf, the Gemara said that first type of connecting, allowing you to be mafresh is not called mukaf. That's just No, it's called you're allowed to be mafresh from one or the other. Okay, let me say this. What happens if you had a big ball of dough and you want to be mafresh from the left side and the right side? You wouldn't say it's mukaf. You'd say it's just one big ball of dough.
Yeah,
so, right. That's what he's saying. In this case, you don't need mukaf. As if it's all one big piece together, you don't need to be mukaf one or the other. Mukaf means when they're in separate containers, they have to bring it. Yeah, it's better than mukaf. Yeah, but if what we colloquially would call mukaf, but he's saying that's not technically the word mukaf. Mukaf is for the second category. When they're already in it clear, they can't have to touch each other. You're going to hear the significance of that in a second. Why?
They have to be in the same room.
For the first category, they have to be in the same room. Yeah. For the first category, they have to be in the same room. The third category, where they're in a kingdom that are closed up, doesn't make a difference. No matter what you do, you cannot be one together. It's automatic. It's as if one would be here and one would be in Pittsburgh. There's no way to be entire if they're in a kingdom that are closed up. But give them back.
Even trying to look at the evidence that work.
Yeah, it works video.
But it sounds like you're saying you can't do it.
No, it means video. It means
it's fine.
Right, that's going to be the next time we'll talk about how these didn't apply to Challah Sutzah. Today we're not talking about that. They were just about the din of mukaf by itself. Next time is about Challah Sutzah. Okay, so the Gemara brings very strong rights to these three categories. Now these three categories that he says, I didn't see anybody who preceded him who organized it so clearly and made such rules like this. Okay? There are many Rishonim who I said before, many Rishonim who say that in order to be mukaf, they have to be touching, they have to have neshicha, they have to be in a clean, all kinds of shittas, and those Rishonim are pretty clear. But that this organization that he says, he says there are three categories. These three categories you didn't see, and it's not clear that everybody agreed to it. Okay? So he says like this. The first comes like this. The Mishnah says, the Mishnah in Challah says, that if a person has two isers, and he wants to eat mafresh from one or the other, and the problem is that one is tamei and one is tahar. So the Mishnah gives you an answer. That says what you should do is take a little piece of dough that's less than a shear of a be'ah, and something that's less than a shear of a be'ah can't transfer tumah. And what you do is you use this little piece as a bridge between the tamei dough and the tahar dough. And use this little piece of dough that's less than a kabeah, and you put it in between to be as the bridge in between. Okay, so that's what the Mishnah says you should do if you want to be mafresh from tamei on tahar or the other way around. Okay, so some Rishonim say, wait a second, you see from this Mishnah that in order to be mukaf, it needs to be touching each other. There's some Rishonim bring a right from this Mishnah because it says you have to make this bridge. This widening the bridge. Why don't you just say they're in the same room? What the whole problem of the Mishnah that the tamei and the tahar are going to touch each other? What's the problem? They're in the same room. It should be considered min hamukaf. You should be allowed to be mafresh. So Rishonim say you see from here that in order to make it min hamukaf, they have to be touching. The Gemara says, well, what? So the Gemara says, he says, you could say that if you look at the Mishnah. He says, but if you look at Yerushalmi, Mamash talks about this. Yerushalmi says, "Ve'ein habayis mitzaref." The Yerushalmi says, why are we doing this? Why are we putting this piece of dough between here? Isn't the bias mitzaref them? In other words, we can make mukaf without touching each other. What's going on over here? To which Yerushalmi answered, no, over here. Since the person is specifically makbid that they shouldn't touch each other, so there's like something he's separating them. So theoretically, the bias would be mitzaref them. But in a case like this, where the person bedafka does not want them to touch each other because of the tumah of the tire shipling, therefore in that case, you dafka need them to touch each other if you want to be mafresh from one another. But if there's an inherent reason why you would not want them to touch each other, then you need to touch it. Okay, but if you wouldn't, if there's no special reason why they shouldn't touch each other, then just being in the room is enough. Okay, so the Gemara says that's a riot to his, that there is at least an example when you could be mafresh from one or the other without them touching. Okay, that there's such a thing, that there's a tzir of bias, that a bias can be mitzaref them is Yerushalmi. The Yerushalmi's understanding of the Mishnah, that here you think the Mishnah says just the opposite. No. The Mishnah is actually telling us only in the case of tumah v'tayr do they have to touch, but in every other case they don't. So there is at least a case when you could be mafresh from one or the other just by being in the same room. Okay. That doesn't yet tell us which case it is. It just tells us there is a case like that. So then the Gemara says, look at the Tosefta in Trumas. Okay, if any of you haven't classed that recently, the Parak Gimel. Okay, Halacha. And the Tosefta says like this. the Tosefta says if a person has loose fruit, he has fruit that it took me truma. Okay, I didn't mention to you, truma also needs to be in a mukaf. Truma does, meiser does not. Okay, truma has to be in a mukaf. So if you have truma that's loose in your house, just loose fruit hanging in your house, then the Yerushalmi said, the Tosefta says you could be marked from one fruit on the other one as long as you're in the same house. Okay, so that's the case of what we keep saying, tzira from a bias. Just being in the house together, there's 10 apples sitting here loose on the room. The Tosefta gives a few cases. You're allowed to be marked from one on the other. Then the Tosefta says, what happens if you have bags of grain or chaviyos of groigras, figs in a chavis? Then the Mishnah says, I'll read the word. It says, "Kulam b'hakefa achas tarmin ma'asim yizalzeh." If they're b'hakefa achas, then you could mark from one on the other one. So the Gemara says, how come at the beginning of the Tosefta it said, if they're in the same house, you could mark from one on the other one? And then the second case in the Tosefta says, if they're b'hakefa achas, you could be marked from one on the other one. He says, the change in Lashon in the Tosefta tells us that there's a difference between tziruf of a bias and mukaf. Tziruf bias and mukaf are not the same thing. Tziruf of bias is for loose things, like the first case. The guy says mufuzarim. The Yerushalmi said they're just mufuzarim in the room, as opposed to when they're in a kli, like in a bag of flour or a chavis of groigris. In that case, you need a different standard. The standard is not the bias achas. The standard there is it has to be mukaf. Okay, what does mukaf mean? So the Gemara says mukaf means that they're touching. We'll talk a little more about that in a while. That he says mukaf means they're touching. So obviously mukaf doesn't mean touching. The food is touching because they're in a bag or they're in a kli. So it must mean that the kalim have to be touching each other. So you see even the Tosefta, the way it split up these two cases, that when the Yerushalmi told us that there's such a thing as being in a bias, tziruf in a bias, that means for loose items, but the case where we do mukaf, which is not tziruf bias, when we do mukaf, that's for the case when they're inside kind of a kli. Okay, and now, how do we know the third case? So far we did two of the categories of gross items. Okay, it's two categories so far. What about the third category? The third category, which is if it's in a sealed kli, then you can never be mafresh from one on the other one. So the Gemara says that comes from a Mishnah in Meiser Sheni. Okay, and the Mishnah at the end of also the third paragraph, towards the end of the third paragraph, Meiser Sheni says that if you have barrels of wine, if they're open, if they're actually gopan, before you seal, close them up, then tarumi achas alakol. Then you could mark from one or the other one. Umishekofan. Once you close them up, then tarumi kol achas achas. Then you can only be marked from each one on itself. You can't be marked from one on the other one. Certainly that might change. Or truma. You can't be marked from one on the other one. So the Gemara says, wait a second. You said to me, if they're in, before you close up the barrel, you could be marked from one or the other one. That means that they're touching each other. Because I just told you, that means they have to be touching each other. So why, if they're sealed, can't you be marked from one or the other one? Or at least say, if they're touching, then you can be marked from one or the other one. That tells you that once something is sealed up, once the container is sealed, then you cannot be marked no matter what. There's no way to be marked from one or the other one if it's in a sealed container. Okay? So the third category, that in a sealed container you can't be marked from one or the other one, comes from this Mishnah in Meiser Sheni.
Does it mean covered or sealed?
Okay, so it's actually a question. The Gemara says it means covered. What'd you say though?
It's a puzzle.
The Gemara says it means covered, and there's actually, I was going to say that there's a machlokes Yerushalmi on this Mishnah of Meiser Sheni, whether actually is it specific to wine that this din says. Okay, the Yerushalmi has a tzad that it's specific to wine. Maybe only that wine, a wine barrel that's sealed, has this special din and nothing else. Because what about barrels of oil and things like that? Maybe they don't have this special din. Which is very much negated to us, because the Gemara says it as any closed container has this din that you can't be marked from one or the other one. Okay, it's actually a machlokes Yerushalmi, which one? And the Rambam paskins lahoko, that only for wine does it make a difference if it's in a sealed container. If it's not wine, then it doesn't make a difference. So the Gemara doesn't say like that. It's not clear why. He's passing like the shita of the Nekel Yerushalmi. It's not clear why he's passing like that shita. And this question, what does it mean? What's unique about wine that makes it that only wine should have that? And it has to do with what you asked, that whether it's sealed or not sealed. Some people say it's just a chashivas of wine. Somehow the chashivas of wine, once in a sealed container, has a special chashivas, and now it won't be mature for anything else. And some people say that the point of sealing wine is it's a sealed container prevents it from spoiling, because it's a din, and it's also the mitzvah is that air is what makes wine turn into vinegar. So sealing it is you need to preserve it. And therefore, the Mishnah doesn't mean it's a dafka wine. When the Yerushalmi said outside of wine, it didn't mean wine. It means anything that seals it, that permanently, that preserves the product, is like an extra special kind of a seal. And that's what keeps it together, which can have nafkaminas to us, because it means that we have a sealed something else to prevent it from spoiling, which is why we usually do. Then we can't have the din of one also. Okay. I said that real quickly. Okay, let's go on.
But the Gemara seems to apply it to every food.
Yes, the Gemara says it's for every food. There is a sheet in Yerushalmi like that. It's not clear why possibly. Maybe we'll have a reason in a second. Okay. Well, yeah, the Rambam says it's tafka by wine, which is like it's a machlokes in Yerushalmi like that. Okay, so why the Gemara says not like that? It's not so clear. Okay. Okay. Especially we would say, for us, Chal Sutzar, this is Rabbanon. We would have said if you have a Shalom in Yerushalmi, unless you have some special reason to pass that, we would have been passing like the Mekilim, that in order to be mature, that only, what's the makeup for us? Right? That wine, no, the cooler for us is to say that no matter what the container is, it's not mature. Oh, I don't know what is the cooler. Yeah, you can't be married from one or the other. It's only limit that to wine and everything else you could be married. We would have been passing like the Rambam. Well, okay. So that's the question. Why he would say that? Okay. Now.
He's not talking about Kashrus, though. It's just for the record.
The Rambam is not?
No, the Gemara.
Well, what do you think he's talking about?
The Gemara's talking about in general. The Gemara.
That's true. Okay, that's true. That's true. He's talking about, most places say Challah, even, we treat Challah Eretz nowadays like a Java.
It's treated differently for purposes of...
So you think maybe he would have been, okay, it's not, I don't know, the Mishnah Berurah, he for sure is on the Challah Sutzar. He brings this. Okay, but it's not clear why the Gemara doesn't say that. Maybe we'll have an explanation in a second. Maybe a little bit. Okay, now, I a little bit didn't tell you the whole story. I just got to add a piece on here that the Gemara doesn't talk about. I didn't tell you the whole story. When I told you the Tosefta says these two, the second case, about a bag of flour and a chavis of goigris, okay? The Gemara said that you see from there that if it's in a container, then they have to be touching each other. Okay, that was it. Now, the only problem is that I only told you two of the cases. There's only three cases there. Okay? And the three cases are, listen to the Tosefta, Saki Tfua, the Igulei Tevel, the Chavi Yeshel goigris. Okay? Now, what's with Igulei Tevel? Igulei Tevel means somebody took a bunch of figs together, stuck them together, and they dried in a clump into this ring that people get. Like you can even buy nowadays. It's such a thing like that. It's a clump together in a ring the way it dries together. Okay? Well, where's the kli? The Gemara says the point of this second half of the Tosefta is since it's in a kli, the kli don't have to be touching each other. Okay, where's the kli? Igulei there doesn't mean it's in the kli. So where's the kli? The Tosefta says it. Rambam brings that case also. So what's going on? Well, what does he mean when he says it's only a kli? It made me think that maybe when the Gemara says kli, we shouldn't take that so literally. It's hard to believe because the Gemara really makes a point of this. But maybe what the Tosefta is saying is that when peiros are loose, then a bias can be mitzaref then. As soon as the peiros have their own units to them, they're gathered together into their own separate little places, then you need something better to be mitzaref them. You can't just be mitzaref them in bias. The normal way you do that is you put them in the kli. You put 6 apples in this big and 5 apples in this big, then each one of them is its own thing. But if you find some other way to make it into a unit, like you make it igulei, you find some other way to create a unit out of it, things can't be mature with each other just by being in the same house. They have to be touching in order to be mature with each other. Okay, which if that would be correct, again, the Gemara does not say. The Gemara keeps talking about them being in kelim. If that would be correct, they'll have nafkaminas to us in other cases. So for now, we'll just leave it hanging. Okay? What does it mean? Here he keeps talking about it's a kli, and one of the cases he uses is not a kli. Okay. We'll put that on the side. So now that we saw this Gemara, okay, let's go back to see what the Shulchan Aruch says. So if you just read the Shulchan Aruch, if you did not read the Gemara on the bottom of the page, you would say is the Shulchan Aruch says. Kivin Shishtem the fun mafresh mizuazu. Shulchan Aruch sounds like he's saying is as long as it's in the same house, you could be mafresh one on the other one. No, none of these other conditions. Doesn't say anything about kalim. Doesn't say about kalim touching each other. You can't do it. Nothing. It just says shtem the fun. You could be mafresh mizuazu. It sure doesn't sound like he's saying like the Gra. That's if you read this thing, that's what you would say. It sure sounds like with this whole Gra on the bottom here, doesn't sound like what it says over there. Okay? But you would only say that if you were going to Challah. Okay, because in that this is Siman Shin Chafei of the Challah. If you look, I'm not so smart. The Gemara tells you to look there. If you look at Shin Lamed Aleph, in Hilchos Truma, there's a really long Siman on Hilchos Trumas Mashers, and there the Shulchan Aruch tells you what it means to make a Mukaf. He gives you the details of what it means to make a Mukaf. And guess what it says? First it says is one case. This is what Shalom in the Mukaf is. It says if you have 50 apples in this house and 50 apples in a different house. You want to be mafresh truma. He says you can't just take 2 from this house, be mafresh on the whole 100, because these are not minamukah for the other ones. The 50 in this house are not minamukah for the other ones, so you can't be mafresh on these 2 on the whole 100. That's shalom minamukah. Then he says, what happens if you have peres mifuzarim in a bias, then you can be mafresh from one on the other one. What's that? That's a Tosefta. That's the first case of Tosefta. You have Peres Mefuzar on the bias, you can be mafresh from one on the other one. This is all I'm reading from Shulchan Aruch. Next case. What happens if you have Sake Tvua, V'Igu Edvela, V'Chavi Yashad Groigris? What's the din then? If the Behekefa Achas, then you could mafresh from one on the other one. That's the second case in the Tosefta. And then he says, and what happens if you have a barrel of wine that's in a sealed barrel, then you could never be mafresh from one on the other one, even if you could never be mafresh from one on the other one. And that is the Mishnah in wherever the other Mishnah was. Okay, the Mishnah of Ma'aser Sheni. Okay, so the Shulchan Aruch brings all three cases. The three cases from which the Gra builds the three categories are right here in Sim and Halacha Chavav. They're right here. So if you learned in Hilchos Challah, it says Shtein Lefanav you can mafresh, and you didn't see this, then you would know what he's talking about. Okay, look in here in Sim and Lamed Aleph, you find out that the Mukaf seems to be exactly what the Gra described. The three categories. The first one he says the bias is enough. The second one he says he uses the word Mukaf, and the third one he says if they're in sealed containers, you can't be mafresh one on the other one.
It's wine.
What did you say?
We're going to say that the Jewish of Meiser is the same as the other.
Yeah, Challah is like Truma. If anything, it's the other way around. If anything, Challah, some Rishon World has stricter din than Truma. But it has the same kind of din. Now, about the yayin part of it, it's a question in Girsa. The Shulchan Aruch on our page does not say the word yayin. He just says as if they're in a container. If Chavius, Shloisasam is PM or Shloisasam is PM. On the bottom it says, no, it's a mistake, it's really say yayin. Okay, so you take it or leave it. Whichever one you want, whatever sheet you want to hold like. The Shulchan Aruch doesn't say the word yayin. Okay, the word yayin is not in Shulchan Aruch. The Rambam says that this din is almost a direct quote out of the Rambam. Okay, this whole thing, these three cases is almost a direct quote, but if you look at the Shulchan Aruch, it doesn't have the word wine. Okay? Which is maybe where the quote is coming from, to not pass like that sheet. Okay. Okay, so the Shulchan Aruch shows it's an again. Now, if you look back at our din, now when the Shulchan Aruch said El Kishashtein Lefanav Mafrishim Yisu Alzu, he didn't mean to tell you how to make Mukaf. He means to say is not like all those other Rishonim who hold they have to be touching and they have to be in the kli, all kinds of other shitas. Kishashtein Lefanav is good enough. There is such a thing as being mafresh from one or the other without all those things that people say like touching. Okay, he's not telling you how to do Mukaf. That's how you're supposed to know that in a couple of pages later he's going to tell you how to do Mukaf. Okay, so far. I'm going to ask you to pause it. So far, the Shulchan Aruch sounds like he's saying exactly like what the Rambam said, like the Gra said. Okay, so the question is, if other people agree with that, so there's two Shachs that I want to tell you about. One is in Shin Chavdalad. The Shach is talking about a case, it's not negated us what the case is, but the Shach is talking about a case of a person being mafresh from one thing or the other, whatever the reason is why they're being mafresh from one or the other. A special case here in Shulchan Aruch. And the Shach says, what you could do is, you have the thing that needs the hafrashah, and you're bringing something else to do the hafrashah on it. So the Shach says, if you put them in containers, if they're both in containers, they're in kelim, and you want to be mafresh from one or the other one, then they don't have to be touching each other. Okay, but they're close to each other. They don't have to be touching each other. Then you could mafresh from one or the other. Okay, so at first glance, the Shach sounds like not like what the Gra said, because the Shach makes a point of saying that they don't have to be touching each other. So it sure sounds like, and they're in kelim. His case, the second case of the Gra, which is they're in kelim, he says that they're in kelim, yet he says they don't have to be touching each other. So at first glance, it seems like he's saying not like the Gra. If you look at it more carefully, it's not so clear, because it could be all he means is that the foods are not touching each other. Okay? It doesn't mean the kelim are not touching; it means the foods, because obviously the foods can't touch. They're in a kli. And the reason to think that is because he says there's this condition they have to be smuchos. Well, where did that come from? Why would they have to be smuchos if they don't have to be touching? Where did he come up with this thing they have to be smuchos? So it sounds like he's saying exactly like the Gra said. He's saying is they have to be smuchos. In this case, the word smuchos doesn't mean close. It means is as close as possible. Okay? It means is the foods can't touch because they're in a kli. But they have to be smuchos. Make them as close as you could to each other. And they don't have to touch each other, which actually, the way the Gra said, would fit very smoothly to explain us what the Shach is trying to talk about. Okay? There are other ways to read the Shach. Okay? Now, but what's odder is that we learned, turn to Shim and Shin Lamed Aleph. I told you the Shulchan Aruch has all three cases, all three that are laid out the way the Gra does. He doesn't say the detail of this is in a kli and that's Mukaf, and if it's not in a kli, then it's called Shir Bias. But the three cases are right there in Shulchan Aruch. And the Shach doesn't have very much to say about this din. He sort of paraphrases what it says in Shulchan Aruch. He doesn't add very much to our reading to what it says in Shulchan Aruch. It seems to be just paraphrasing it. But if you read it, it's really odd, because he paraphrases the first case of the Shulchan Aruch and the third case of the Shulchan Aruch and completely ignores the second case of Shulchan Aruch. So what's that? Why is he missing out the case of Sake Tfua, where the things are in Kalim, and that the Shulchan Aruch says they have to be touching each other. He doesn't say that, but they have to be Behekei Fa'achas. They have to be something. There's a higher standard when they're in Kalim. He like glosses over. He talks about the first case, he says the third case, but he misses the second case. What happened? Does that tell us that maybe he doesn't hold to this then? That if they're in a Kli, they have to be touching each other. The Kalim have to touch each other. So, I don't know if you can like this or not like this. I'm going to give you a very answer. Okay, really, a very non-sophisticated answer to this question, and that is, if you look at Halacha Chavav, okay, if you look at Halacha Chavav, you open up in Shulchan Aruch, you'll see that the second case in Shulchan Aruch is in parentheses. Okay, very odd. It's in parentheses. Okay, so I was struck by that. Why is it in parentheses? It's almost a literal quote out of the Rambam, and the Rambam, all three cases are there. What's with the parentheses? So I looked in one of the newer Shulchan Aruchs, and it says that middle case didn't exist in the Shulchan Aruch until the printing in the year Taf Chaf Beis, okay, in the 1600s, okay, in the year 1662, okay. It didn't appear in print until that year, and the year 1662 is actually the year the Shach died, okay, and the Sefer the Shach on your day was printed about 15 years before that, okay. So in the Shach Shulchan Aruch, it didn't say that middle case. So if you want to know why the Shach just paraphrases the first and the third din, it doesn't say anything about the second din, because he didn't have the second din. It wasn't there. There was no second din. In the Shach Shulchan Aruch, there was no second din. Okay, so he didn't say very much about it. So it's not like he's going into like what the Rambam said, this and that, but you wonder why he didn't say anything about it, because he didn't say it wasn't there. There wasn't a first and second, case number 1, case number 3, and case number 2 was blank. Okay, so that's why it doesn't say it. Now, but that, once I told you, now the Gra, who lived like 50 years later, okay, in his Shulchan Aruch, I don't know what his Shulchan Aruch looked like, but he probably had it. It's not even so clear that when Gra says, look at this Shulchan Aruch, it's not so clear that he means to say it has all three dinim. He says, look at the Rambam and the Shulchan Aruch and the set that he keeps on going. It's not clear that he means to bring a right from this Shulchan Aruch that all three cases. So I don't know what it said in his Shulchan Aruch. I don't know what it said in the Gra Shulchan Aruch. But now that I told you that, now I have to turn that around on you. Because now I have to reconsider what the Mechaber held. I told you a minute ago that the Mechaber is saying exactly like the Gra. It means all three cases, and divides them up in the way the Gra wants them to be divided up. He's saying all three cases. Now, if the Shulchan Aruch left out the middle case, what does that tell us about it?
Maybe the printer left it out, but it was in the original Kisvei Yad. What did
honestly, I mean,
version say?
Wait.
It said it wasn't in the editions until 1662.
The Shulchan Aruch, the Mechaber died 150 years before that. So what happened? Somebody woke up, they found it.
Maybe it was in Ksav Yad. What does it say? What's the reason it was inserted? Was it based on Ksav Yad, or if somebody else came along and said, the Mechaber left this out?
I don't see, I'm not that kind of a researcher, so I can't tell you the answer.
That's an important question.
But I don't know the answer. It doesn't say in the Shulchan Aruch that I said it says in Taf Chaf Beis. It makes sense if it just showed up. The impression is the person saw that these dinim are in the Rambam. The Rambam has all three cases, and the Rambam left one out. So he stuck one in. It's not clear where it came from. It's like magically it just appeared. It just from that year on, it just appeared. Where it came from?
Must be that they found it in Ksav Yad, and that's why they put it in.
I have no idea. Now, but it's like this. But I'll tell you a different variation of that. Okay. Now, to say that the Mechaber didn't hold to the second case would be very odd. I mean, I'm saying to you as if it's not there. It would be very odd because, it's a Tosefta. The Tosefta brings this case. He brought the other half of the Tosefta. It wasn't like he didn't know there was a Tosefta. There's no basis on this thing. So, if he's quoting the Rambam, Mamish word for word from a Rambam, and he's going to skip out, 10 words in the middle, you think he'd have to tell us why he did that. You think there'd be some explanation. I skipped those words for this reason. So, to think that he quoted the Rambam almost word for word, without telling us why not, it seems like a little odd. I think he doesn't hold like that. Come on. So there's something to say right about that. But it might tell us something else. Okay. The whole Gra, everything that I told you from the Gra is built on, essentially, on two pieces of information. Okay? Everything is built on these two pieces of information. And one is that the word Mukaf and the word tzir of bias are not the same thing. Okay? It's a very subtle diuk that the word, sometimes we use the word Mukaf, sometimes we say habayis mitzaref, and we're making a diuk that those words are not the same. That when the Tosefta says the bias and the tarifim, and then it says kefa ahaz, those don't mean the same thing. Which is a diuk. I don't think that it's not a diuk. There is a point that we're changing words on us. There's a Mishnah in Tful Yon that says to be kefa ahaz. The Yerushalmi says habayis should be mitzaref. So there's a diuk to that, but it's not clear that everybody would hold that the word. See, everybody before I started this morning, people who just learned the Shulchan Aruch think that when the Shulchan Aruch says shteim lefanov, and when he said before mukaf, that all means the same thing. Tzir from the bias and the mukaf, that all means the same thing. So the Gra is being medayik on the words. Not clear that everybody held with that. And also, the Gra is saying that the word mukaf means touching. Okay, it's a big shiloh in Rishonim what the word Mukaf means. Okay, others say that Mukaf means in the same general area or close to each other. Okay, it's not clear. The Gemara is making an assumption that the word Mukaf has a connotation of things that touch each other, rather than just being in the same general vicinity, which many others don't agree with. Many others say the word Mukaf just means they're just in the same basic areas as one another. Based on those two pieces of information, that Mukaf is not tzir bias, and that Mukaf needs touching, the Gemara says, well, why did it say bias, and then it said touching? Oh, bias and touching, those are really different from each other. But it could be that the Mechaber didn't see like that. And that in his mind, touching and bias and Mukaf are all the same thing. So why did the Sefer say two cases? I don't know. But we don't need all these cases. I have to say every single example of how you can make Mukaf. So I have to tell you the first thing, which is the bias can be mitzarefim, because that's how it works. I have to tell you the third thing, that if it's in a sealed container, you can't have Mukaf no matter what you do. You can't have Mukaf. But do I have to give you every gory detail of how you can make tzir? So maybe you didn't feel you have to do it. What I'm saying is that the fact that he left out the middle case sounds like he doesn't like the Gemara, but that's really odd to argue, like cut out a page out of the Tosefta. But could it be that he just had a different hafrashah? I have to tell you something. Before the Gemara said his thing, that if it's in a kli, they have to be touching each other. Nobody else says that. Nobody reads the Tosefta to be saying, if it's in a kli, they have to be touching each other. It just says, sakei tvua, if they're behek kefa achas, that's okay. What does that kefa achas mean? They're close, they're in the same room, they're in the same general area. I don't know what everybody says. I didn't see anybody making that point, that the kelim have to be touching. This is a very foreign nafkamina that the Gemara is making. Well, maybe the Mechaber didn't hold of that subtleness and of that deal, and so he's not. So he, in his essence, he's arguing the Gemara, but not arguing because somehow he doesn't agree with the Tosefta. Why would you not agree with the Tosefta? He's arguing because maybe he holds that this is really like sort of subsuming to the first case. Maybe I'm not sure what it is. Okay? But the whole thing needs more thought. As I mentioned to you, I mentioned in passing, the Mishabur brings it the way the Gemara says it. The Gemara is so clear, and there's so many shittim in Rishonim, and the Gemara is so clear that many later Achronim quote the Gemara as is, not the whole piece, but the short version, that there are these three categories. This is when you have tzir bias, this is when you have Mukaf, and this is when you have no Mukaf. And lots of people assume like that, but there are those who wonder if maybe this is not really the din, and that maybe before the Gemara nobody thought like this, and that they really Mukaf and tzir bias is all the same stuff, with the one exception that if it's in a sealed container, and even if maybe only a sealed container of wine, a sealed container, then you can't have it, but everything else otherwise, basically being in the same room is it is. Okay, so now, before I finish, I'll tell you. What? In Tatnan Zayin, Sikhan Zayin, I think it is. In Tatnan Zayin is all dealing with Hafrashas Challah, because we talked about it a number of times about for matzah. Okay, so these dinim of Mukaf would be negated to a certain amount of people in the house. Okay, let's say if a person forgot to be mafresh challah when it was a batter, and they won't be mafresh challah until they had shaped it into bread or to roll challahs, so they have to have Mukaf. So then all of a sudden they can have 10 challahs on the table, they have to know how to do Mukaf, and let's say if you put the challahs into baking pans, all of a sudden according to the Gemara, it's not been a Mukaf. Okay, if you put all your challahs into baking pans, you say, oh my gosh, I forgot to mafresh challah, then you have to touch those all together, or cover them over with something to make them be bin a Mukaf. So these kind of cases could come up for people at homes also. Okay, again, when I say that because, not just to tell you, I say it because when you ask Rabbanim, you say to them, what do you have to do? The lady says, I forgot to be mafresh challah when it was dough. What should I do to be mafresh challah now? And they say, it's okay, as long as you're all there together, be mafresh challah. Okay? The Gemara, not everybody is going to say over the Gemara, maybe because they don't know, or maybe because that's not the assumption what you have to do. Now, but it has a huge nafkamina for us, for us who want to be mafresh challah with tevel matzah, or tevel dough. Yeah, but we want to be mafresh with tevel matzah, tevel dough, which we've talked about it a dozen times, which is, we have a bakery that's 500 miles away from anybody. It's owned by a Yid, and they're making things that need hafrashas challah. So what do? We put a piece of dough, or we put a box of matzah that's tevel into the building, and into the room, and we're mafresh challah. We say every time you make a batter, another little piece is going to be challah on what you just did hafrashah on. Okay, well, the Gemara said that if it's in a kli, the kelim have to be touching each other. Okay? That's really, really difficult to do. It's almost impossible to do that in a commercial bakery. I'm going to put my box of matzahs connected to the mixing bowl where they're mixing this up, to think that we're going to make the kelim touching each other. So to say to get them into the room would be, maybe you could pull it off. Maybe you could say, go to the room where they do the kneading and stick the matzahs into a corner someplace, put them in a little corner someplace, it'll be in the same room. If you want to get them in a room, you want them to be touching, it's very close, hard to do. And if you say even more that maybe these even qualify for the third category, maybe these categories are in kelim that are sealed. Okay, it's not wine, but the Shulchan Aruch doesn't say wine. It's not clear. The Gemara doesn't say it's only about barrels of wine. So if you have a box of matzahs that are sealed shut, okay, well, That might even be wine, because it's a seal to keep it from spoiling. Or what happens if you take our dough, when we do with dough, you put it into the freezer. Okay? Put it into the freezer, it's in a kli. Remember we talked about last time, that if the freezer is big enough, like it usually is in a commercial bakery, then it's going to be memsa. It's not even in the same room. It's in a different room completely. So then everyone should agree that in these cases, it should live in a mukaf. So the thing is, if you're like Yossi said, if you're mafresh live in a mukaf, it works for the edit. Okay, it works for the edit. But why do we set up hafrashas like that? Here we do. We do it all the time. It's a standard practice to do these hafrashas. How does this tevel system work? Tevel dough or tevel matzah? They're in this case roughly similar. The way the Gra said, you have to, if they're in Kalim, at least they have to be touching each other. You know, if you tell me that, no, that's not really the truth, and somehow you'll tell me that really, it just has to be in the same room, okay, that's possible. You could maybe pull that off to get them in the same room. But if you say like the Gra says, the Mishnah, again, a lot of the later Acharonim quote this Gra. The Gra, it's pretty hard to start up when the Gra says, even the guy in the Olam got confused about this thing. It's like, you schnook who think that you say better than me, so it's hard to argue with that. But anyhow, so how do we do this?
Just open the box of matzahs.
So you could open the box of matzahs. Wait. If you open the box of matzahs, this has to be touching. The open candle has to be touching. Okay, and it doesn't help us for us. We like to do tevel dough. We can leave it open out in the room. It's going to be gone in 10 minutes. It has to be in the freezer. Okay, I can't tell you that I'm going to give you a good answer to that question. In the next 2 times, we're going to talk about different possibilities of how we could maybe lighten the question or somehow make it not as serious as it is. And after we're finished the next 2 times, you're going to still tell me that the question is better than the answer, which it probably is. But this thing of Mukaf is going to be a very serious issue for us. Anybody uses this tevel system, it's, to my understanding, the weakest link in using tevel. We've talked in the past about advantages of dough over matzah, or maybe even some of matzah over dough, but all tevel systems have this weakness built up to them